subject matter today is the exclusive knowledge economy, the knowledge economy for the few that exists, and the potential which its exclusive character suppresses. Subject matter for next week is the knowledge economy for the many, the inclusive knowledge economy, and therefore also the means by which we could get from the exclusive knowledge economy of today to the inclusive knowledge economy that we would have reason to desire. Let's retrace our steps first and proceed deliberately. So first, the concept of the most advanced practice of production. In every historical epoch, there is a most advanced practice of production. It is not necessarily, as I observed in an earlier class, when it first emerges, the most efficient or productive practice, the practice that produces the most output with the fewest inputs. It is, however, the practice with the greatest fecundity and potential to reach the frontier of productivity, to stay there, and to influence and inspire the transformation of the whole economy around it. In the late 20th century, the most advanced practice of production was industrial mass production, also often called Fordist mass production. The large-scale production of standardized goods and services with relatively rigid machines and productive processes on the basis of semi-skilled labor and a very hierarchical and specialized relations of production, the technical division of labor. When industrial mass production, conventional industry, was the predominant advanced practice of production, development economics, the theory of development and of growth, had a coherent message. The message can be summarized in a simple formula. There is a shortcut to unconditional economic convergence, that is, convergence to the circumstances of the richest countries at that time. The shortcut is to take workers and resources from the less productive parts of the productive system and to put them in the most productive parts. In effect, in practice, to take them from agriculture and to put them in industry. This was the shortcut. It was always recognized that the ability to take this shortcut depended ultimately on the constraints imposed by two sets of fundamentals. And the two sets of fundamentals were, on one side, the institutions, and on the other side, education. And I have already observed that these fundamentals, in fact, imposed only a very loose constraint. The education required of a worker in a conventional factory in the age of mass production was very minimal, modest. And similarly, the institutional requirements were very lax. It was enough to have a mixed market economy with an administrative apparatus that had a place for the development economists themselves. Now, industrial mass production, conventional industry, has ceased to be the most advanced practice of production. This shortcut has stopped working. And the decline of industrial mass production has decisive consequences for politics. Conventional industry, after all, was the anchor, the headquarters of historical social democracy. And its main constituency, the workers employed in the capital-intensive parts of the economy, especially in conventional industry. When conventional industry declines, when it ceases to be the advanced sector, historical social democracy loses its base, its core constituency. And that is the most powerful reason for the subversion, the destruction of the hegemony of the progressive parties in the West. And for the opening of politics to right-wing populism. Now, why did conventional industry decline? Conventional industry declined because a new vanguard arose that could outproduce it, that could not only produce new things that the old vanguard was unable to produce, but could produce the old things, the things that the old vanguard did produce, better and more cheaply. And then the old vanguard, conventional industry, survived either as a vestige of its former self in its former role, on the basis of lower wages and a lower tax take in the countries in which it continued to have a hold, or as a satellite, a sidekick to the new vanguard. The new vanguard discovered a way to divide the process of production into two parts. A commoditized or routinized part that it could then subcontract to firms and workers in remote parts of the world, and the creative and lucrative part which it kept for itself. There then emerges a new dilemma of development in the world. And the whole world begins to be preoccupied with this new dilemma. I described it last week. One side of the dilemma is that the shortcut to unconditional economic convergence, to rapid economic growth, seems no longer to work. The shortcut is closed. Now then, what is the alternative? The alternative would be an inclusive form of the new vanguard, the knowledge economy. But this inclusive form seems not to exist. And if it doesn't exist even in the countries with the most advanced system of production and the most educated population, how can it be expected to exist in the rest of the world? That's then the fundamental economic condition which gives rise, or helps give rise, to this turmoil in national politics. Historical social democracy was the political project that could rely on the predominance of conventional industry as its productive base. Now, historical social democracy if we view it in an unsentimental way, could be seen as based on three sets of arrangements. I'm talking about social democracy as it emerged in the aftermath of the Second World War. The first set of arrangements were arrangements that distinguished between relatively privileged insiders and relatively disadvantaged outsiders. In the first place, in the labor market, that distinguished between workers who had stable jobs in this capital-intensive sector of the economy and something like tenure in their jobs, and a secondary part of the labor market of unstably employed workers or workers employed in the capital-poor parts of the production system. But also between small business and big business. Historical social democracy protected small business against big business. And historical social democracy promoted the practice that came to be called as social contracts or social compacts, also called incomes policies, which were agreements about the distribution of the benefits and costs of different macroeconomic policies, in the hope that a consensual distribution of costs and benefits would diminish economic trauma or turmoil and facilitate steady economic growth with high employment. The repertoire of historical social democracy was attacked by neoliberalism as being both inefficient because it imposed costly rigidities and unfair because it benefited insiders to the detriment of outsiders. The attack on historical social democracy was spearheaded by what came to be known as neoliberalism. And social democracy then, under the brunt of this attack, of this neoliberal attack, and above all as a result of the weakening of its historical base in conventional industry, retreated to the last line of defense. It gave up the arrangements labeled incomes policy or social contracts. It gave up many of the forms of defense of insiders against outsiders, including defense in the labor market of the relatively stable workers, and it retreated to its last line of defense. The last line of defense was the preservation of a high level of entitlements, of social entitlements, such as entitlements in health and education, paradoxically financed by the regressive and indirect taxation of consumption, especially through the comprehensive flat rate value-added tax or some functional equivalent to it. The eviscerated or hollowed out form of social democracy that resulted from this retreat is what we can call social liberalism. And social liberalism has a better claim to be described as the hegemonic project today than historical social democracy. Social liberalism is the diminished form of historical social democracy that resulted from the collision of historical social democracy with neoliberalism, and above all, from the shrinking or subversion of the historical basis of social democracy in conventional industry. Now, what results, which is this eviscerated form of historical social democracy. This flexibilized or liberalized form, which we can call social liberalism, has proved relatively ineffective to address, much less to solve, the major problems of the contemporary societies. First of all, the attenuation of inequality. The inequality is anchored in the structural divisions of the production system, especially in the chasm which becomes deeper and deeper between the vanguard, the advanced sectors of production, and the rear guard, the backward sectors. If this chasm becomes very deep, then the traditional devices for the moderation of inequality, compensatory redistribution through progressive taxation, and through redistributive social spending, become inadequate to achieve it. The corrective redistribution by progressive taxation or redistributive social spending would have to be vast to attenuate these major inequalities. And long before it reached the requisite dimension to overcome or attenuate the inequalities, it would begin to destabilize the arrangements and incentives of the production system. So the attenuation has to be the attenuation of inequality has to be very modest. The second problem of historical social democracy that this diminished, that the contemporary societies generate, and that the liberalized, eviscerated form of social democracy, social liberalism, is even less capable of resolving or addressing, is social cohesion. In its European home ground, the organization of redistributive transfers by the state seemed to be a sufficient basis for social cohesion only when those societies were like little tribes, based on ethnic, cultural, and religious homogeneity. But as the level of homogeneity is eroded, especially by migration, the inadequacy of money as a social cement becomes manifest. And the third great problem of the contemporary societies, which historical social democracy and its liberalized form, social liberalism, have proved inadequate to resolve, is the enactment and repetition of structural change. In all these societies, democracy remains weak or flawed, and the rule persists that without trauma, there is no change. Trauma, especially in the form of war and of economic ruin or collapse. And this failure of the left of center parties and of the right of center parties to solve or even address the problems of contemporary societies is then the opportunity for the emergence of right-wing populism. Right-wing populism, however, itself has no coherent structural program. Its characteristic productive program is in fact very close to the program of social democracy. To buy a few more years for declining mass production industry, behind the barriers of protectionism or of subsidies or of constraints on offshoring and plant closings. And to strengthen executive authority, its only constitutional project. So both social liberalism and right-wing populism characteristically offer non-structural solutions to structural problems. And thus, the uncertainty, the openness, the turmoil of political life persists. Now, against this background in political economy, there emerges in the world a new dilemma of development. And I've already sketched it out in the broadest terms. The dilemma is this. The shortcut that development economics recommended in the second half of the 20th century has stopped working. The shortcut was conventional industry. The alternative to that shortcut would be a broad-based, socially inclusive form of the new vanguard, the knowledge economy. But that alternative doesn't exist. If it doesn't exist even in the most educated economies, even in the most advanced economies with the most educated populations, how can we expect it to exist in the rest of the world? That's the dilemma. And that dilemma now begins to preoccupy the entire world, which little by little discovers its terms. Now, I anticipate my position with respect to this dilemma. My position is that the dilemma can be broken, if it can be broken at all, only on the second side. That is, there's no way in which conventional industry can be brought back to life. The only hope is to turn the seemingly inaccessible task of developing a knowledge economy for the many and inclusive vanguardism into a feasible project by breaking it up into pieces and into steps. And that then is the program that we begin today and continue in class next week. And the first part of that program will be to form an idea of what the new vanguard is. Not just what it is now, but what its potential is. The potential which is suppressed by its present arrangements. Now let me stop there and ask whether someone would like to comment on these initial remarks. This is a very, yes?
Yeah, I had a question about whether the old vanguard of conventional manufacturing essentially is dead to all nation states, or if a small opportunity to take the shortcut exists for countries in which the globalized supply chain may be shifting to, such as Vietnam or Malaysia, or maybe not completely closed, but open for a limited amount of developing countries.
So if the wage is much lower, and if the tax take is lower as well, then there's some way of continuing this activity. But as the new vanguard begins not just to produce new things that the old vanguard couldn't produce, but begins to outproduce the old vanguard, even with respect to the things that it did produce, producing them better and more cheaply, then the shortcut fails altogether. So that's the way things are going. But in that transition, there's still a period in which the old production, the old style of production, can retain some life, especially if it's surrounded by a series of defenses, like the defenses that I mentioned, subsidies, restraints on plant closings or offshoring. The same defenses that are now proposed commonly in these countries, not just by the social democrats, but also by the right-wing populists, as a way of conserving the productive base on which the working class depends. That's the situation. Yes.
So even the industrial mass production, it could not spread across the whole world because a lot of countries remain agricultural primarily.
You mean the poorest countries?
The poorest countries. So why is it such a novel and why is it such a distinct problem that a knowledge economy could not be able to spread across the world?
I'm not sure I understand. So the poorest countries were not yet on this ladder, to be sure, if they were primarily agricultural.
Yeah. So my question is that we are saying that industrial mass production has been the
So this dilemma affected the high-income countries and the middle-income countries. But even the poorest countries, to the extent that they saw a way out, an exit from their poverty, began to enter this field.
So why is it possible? Why is it the same possible for the knowledge economy that they would be able to achieve that to the extent possible for them? Why wouldn't that be possible?
That they would, I'm afraid I didn't
Sorry, I
understand.
will rephrase it. So the dilemma is that if the new vanguard knowledge economy is taking over, or if that is the dominant form of practice of production, the problem is that it would not be able to spread across the world, even if it is able to take strength in the most advanced economies. What I am saying is that why is it such a distinct problem? Because it has been the same in the past, and even if the poorest countries have been able to develop some industrial mass production to the extent possible for them, why couldn't they do the same with regard
Well,
to
you're
knowledge
assuming,
economy?
I think one of the things that you're assuming is that the knowledge economy is necessarily a vanguard just for manufacture. It's not. The knowledge economy, in principle, could exist in every sector of production, including agriculture. So precision or scientific agriculture is a species of the knowledge economy. So even with respect to agricultural production in the poorest countries, the question is, under what conditions, by what means, could they become versions of advanced production? So it's a problem for them by the same means. So, in fact, one of the characteristics of production in the age of the knowledge economy is to have diminished the clarity of the distinction among sectors. So, for example, in the age of the knowledge economy, there's no clear distinction between manufacture and services, because advanced manufacture, to some extent, consists in crystallized and combined intellectual services. The whole distinction among sectors is weakened in the age of the knowledge economy. Yes?
I guess a question I have is, should we, do you understand something like the CHIPS Act or other industrial policy that is trying to both protect sort of conventional industry, but also help them transition to whatever the newest forms of them are?
That's a big addition. So those are two different things. One is just to protect them as they now are.
Right.
The second is to help convert them into versions of the knowledge economy. That's a different project.
My question is about efforts to do the sort of
Yes.
conversion or transition. Do you think that's possible? That's a thing that...
Absolutely. In fact, that's the only thing that's possible, because in principle, you could never begin ex nihilo. You could never begin from nothing. So the most obvious way in which to create an inclusive knowledge economy, a knowledge economy for the many, is to convert what existed before into a version of that. And then, of course, there's a large question of how you do that. But that's the first order task. So it's not as if conventional industry and its associated forms of production were an untransformable object, which then you either have to prop up and defend in some way, or you have to replace by something completely different. That's not the circumstance. Yes?
Would you argue that the retreat of social democracy to social liberalism was inevitable because of the knowledge economy, or that is specifically the result of neoliberals' attacks?
The answer to that question is complicated, inevitable. Inevitable would always make me uncomfortable because I'm not a determinist. But historical social democracy could not have continued to exist in its old form if the practice of production changes fundamentally. So in that sense, the change was inevitable. It was inevitable that it had to adapt to the new advanced practice of production. That's an objective change. But what it did then was to give up all these characteristic arrangements and practices, the incomes policies and the defense of insiders against outsiders, and to retain what was most fundamental. What was most fundamental was the preservation of a high level of entitlements. So I'm a critic of European social democracy. I regard it as, in many ways, a failed project and an inadequate project from the outset. Nevertheless, I recognize that the greatest achievement of historical social democracy was to have achieved a high level of investment in people and in their capabilities. And that was not simply a form of attenuation of inequalities. That was a lifting up of common humanity to a higher order of capability, of power, of agency. That was the great achievement of historical social democracy. And it was a lasting achievement, an achievement which has proved refractory to attack, to subversion. Because in this whole historical period after the Second World War, no right-wing movement in Europe has succeeded in achieving a significant diminishment of the tax take that would result in a diminishment of this high level of investment in people and in their capabilities. And for the most part, the right-wing parties haven't even proposed that. So the European social democracies take in at least 10% of GDP more than does the United States. And they have retained that through thick and thin against all of these storms, and even against the attacks of right-wing populism. So that's a remarkable achievement, which shows, and why? Because the great majority of the population wants the state to preserve this power and recognizes the benefit that results from this high tax take. You know, and this is associated with something that has to be understood. So, about the difference between the United States and the European social democracies. So, on paper, the American tax system appears to be more progressive than the European tax systems because it gives pride of place, it gives a central role to the progressive taxation of personal income. The European systems, in societies which are more egalitarian than the United States, much more equal than the United States, paradoxically rely for taxation on the regressive and indirect taxation of consumption through the VAT or some functional equivalent to it. So how can you explain this paradox? The less equal society has the more progressive tax system. The more egalitarian society has the more regressive tax system. So first of all, structural change trumps corrective redistribution. With respect to structural change, everything that you can do to influence the primary distribution of income and advantage is much more important than anything that you can do after the fact to correct the distribution and achieve a secondary distribution. That's the first principle. The second principle is that with respect to corrective redistribution, the budget, what matters most in the short term is not how progressive the tax system is on its revenue-raising side. What matters is the aggregate level of the tax take and how it is spent. So the basic explanation of this paradox that I just described is that the Europeans were able to take in a significantly higher percentage of GDP as tax take, and then they spent it redistributively, so that everything that was lost by way of progressivity on the revenue-raising side of the budget was gained in double on the spending side. That's the explanation. And it should be a truism of political discourse, but no one explains that to the people. So what happens in the United States is that at election time, the politicians affirm their commitment to progressive taxation, like the progressive income tax, as simply as a way of showing whose side they're on. But they know, or they should know, that progressive taxation, at least in this form, has an entirely marginal effect on the distribution of advance, and they don't explain this paradox that I just described to you. Now, if you were committed to attenuation of inequality through progressive taxation, the income tax is not the way in which you would favor it. So there are two main targets of progressive taxation in principle. One is the accumulation of economic wealth, which is very hard to reach by taxation. The most effective way to reach it is at death, by the confiscation of inheritance or anticipated inheritance through gifts inter vivos. And what about the other target of progressive taxation? The other target of progressive taxation is the hierarchy of standards of living, what a person spends in himself, and how do you reach that? The most effective way to reach that would be an individualized and highly progressive tax on consumption. In taxation, that's known as the Kaldor tax, because its chief theoretician was Nicholas Kaldor, who wrote a book on it called The Expenditure Tax after the Second World War. The Kaldor tax works like this. You take the total income of the individual, capital income and labor income, and you subtract invested saving. That difference is what the individual spends on his standard of living. And you tax that on a steeply progressive rate. So below a certain level, the individual pays nothing. He receives from the state. That's what the Americans call the negative income tax. Then as his standard of living goes up, the rate steeply rises, and at the highest level of luxury living, the sky's the limit. Because in the individualized consumption tax, 100% is not the ceiling of the rate. The rate could be, for example, 500%. You could say, for every dollar that an individual spends on his standard of living, he has to pay $5 to the state. That would be, the highest rate would be 500% then. Now, there's no practical impediment to this tax, because the difficulty of administration is exactly the same as the income tax. So if the progressives in these North Atlantic democracies were both lucid and sincere in their egalitarian profession of faith, this is the tax that they would propose. But of course, no one proposes this tax. Why? It depends simply on political will and power. You want to redistribute through tax? Sure. So organize the tax system around the VAT. That first makes it neutral. The VAT has an advantage. What is the advantage? Is that it allows you to maximize the tax take, minimizing economic disruption. Because conceptually, it is the most neutral tax. It takes a constant proportion of the transfer of every input into an output. And therefore, by definition, if its impersonality and neutrality are preserved, it is neutral with respect to the system of relative prices. That's why it allows you to maximize the tax take while minimizing economic disruption. Then once you have organized the tax system around taxation on consumption, it's easy to add an individualized tax on consumption, the Caldor tax. And then you can have all the corrective redistribution you want if you have enough political power and enough political courage. If this were the objective redistribution, this is how it would be done. But of course, it's not done. So that's a 5-minute explanation of the mysteries of the tax system. The income tax is a blunt instrument which achieves neither of the two targets I just described. It doesn't hit the target of economic power, and it doesn't hit the target of the hierarchy of standards of living. It's essentially a tax on the wages of the so-called middle class. And throughout the world, rich people do not pay income tax. So it's not a tax on the rich at all. It's just a tax on the labor income of the middle classes. And it's, of course, that's what the progressives defend. Would anyone like to comment on this? This is a little aside in our discussion, but I'm sure you can appreciate how significant it would be if it were generally understood. It's not understood. Yes?
I have a question. How is it different from the sales tax, which more aggressively hits the middle class or the working class?
The sales tax is technically a rather primitive tax. It's a transactions tax. So the VAT is a more sophisticated tax because it imagines the entire economy as an input-output table. And it takes a constant proportion of the transfer of every input into an output. So it's neutral with respect to relative prices by definition, if you preserve it against exceptions and anomalies. And that's then why it allows you to take a lot of tax with a minimum of economic disruption, because you're not messing up the system of relative prices. In a sales tax, you do mess up the system of relative prices, because you distinguish between the final producers, the intermediate producers, and so forth. Yes?
I'm just trying to understand what kind of mechanism would allow for this individualized tax on consumption. Is like a luxury tax, would we have taxes on luxury?
No.
Getting closer to that?
No, you don't distinguish between particular goods. Like, if you distinguish between standards of living. So there's no mystery in it. It's exactly the same as an income tax, but you have an exemption or a deduction for what's invested saving. So you demonstrate your invested saving. What you don't demonstrate as invested saving counts as if it had been spent. So you have an interest in demonstrating it, right? And then that difference between total income to capital and labor, there's no distinction made between returns to labor and returns to capital. It's the same. That difference is then what you spend on yourself. That's your standard of living. And that's what you tax on the steeply progressive slope. So if beyond a certain level of spending on yourself will say you'll pay 500% or 300% or whatever it is. As I say, the sky's the limit. It just depends on political power and political will. So if the object of progressive taxation is redistribution, why not do it this way? This is the direct way to do it, as opposed to the labyrinthine way of the income tax. Yes.
So, just to understand, even though generally the flat tax rate would hurt poorer people more, because particularly if it's on necessary goods such as food, what you're saying is that we have a problem with our tax system because we're not getting enough tax, but also, and part of that is the loopholes and other things, but the arcane.
No, wait, just let me stop you for a minute just to clarify something. So the fundamental reason for taxation is to finance the state,
Right.
not to redistribute anything. Now, what I'm doing is, that comes first. It's now you can finance the state in ways that are more or less onerous to productive activity. The way that is least onerous is to be neutral with respect to the system of relative prices. And that's what the VAT does. So the VAT can conceptually, as I say, you put you make of the economy an input-output table, as Leontief proposed, and then you have a tax which takes a constant proportion of the transfer of value of an input to an output. That allows you to maximize your tax take.
But whatever you maximize and receive in your,
Yes.
you still have to, it depends what the government decides to, how they apportion that. For instance, we spend so much on military spending,
Sure.
right? Instead of, and even though we spend a bunch on health too, we don't actually use it
Sure.
efficiently and don't have the public health system. So,
So what I'm saying is, what's the explanation of the success of the European social democracies in having achieved a high level of investment in people and their capabilities? It's very simple, that they take in a lot of taxes, and then they spend part of that money that they take in redistributively by investing in people. So on the revenue raising side, the tax system is regressive, because after all, the poor, the workers, who don't hold assets, spend the relatively greatest part of their income on consumption. So if you're taxing consumption, it appears that the tax system is just regressive. But you say, wait, you can't understand things that way. You have to take into account the whole budget on both the revenue raising side and on the spending side. And if the effect of your regressive tax on the income raising side is to increase the aggregate tax take, and if then what you've lost by way of progressivity on the revenue raising side, you take back, and take back in double on the spending side, then what seemed to be a regressive tax system turns out to be a highly progressive budget. That's what the European social democracies have done. It's really not that complicated. There's a little bit of paradox in it. But after all, if the politics of a democracy has a pedagogic aspect, the politicians should be able to explain that to the people. In what country have they explained that to the people? In no country. And that's, is that not a scandal? Yes.
What would be the end stage of such a redistributive system? Would it be to achieve complete income equality? What is the degree of inequality?
No. So I think, first of all, this would get us into another discussion, because what's the basis of the ideological conflict in the world? You're all quite properly deflecting me from my plan, but so be it. I'll dance with the music. I'll roll with the punches. So the conventional ideological controversy in the world is a conflict between shallow equality and shallow freedom. So who is the left? The left are those who privilege equality against the background of the established institutional arrangements, including the established arrangements of the market. And who are the right? The right are the ones who privilege freedom against that same background. So it's shallow equality versus shallow freedom. Now, take, for example, the theories of justice that have been promoted in the Anglo-American world in the last several decades, like the Rawlsian theory of justice. On their face, they seem to be highly egalitarian. It's all about equality. But they combine the egalitarianism with institutional skepticism or agnosticism. They say nothing about institutions. What is the pragmatic residue of this combination of egalitarianism with institutional conservatism? The pragmatic residues that say these so-called theories of justice are simply justifications of corrective redistribution by tax and transfer, because they're just saying there's inequality corrected after the fact. So it's like a justification for this, for example, progressive income tax. That's what they come down to. So they seem to be highly egalitarian, but then you bring them down to size when you see that they're just pseudo-philosophical props to the homely practices of corrective redistribution under institutionally conservative social democracy. That's what they really are. So they're not what they seem to be. They're something completely different. And so that's the standard ideological debate. Now, what should be the division between right and left? It's a completely different question. And I would say, well, let's look for instruction to the opinions of the liberals and socialists at the beginning of the 19th century and in the middle of the 19th century. What did Karl Marx and John Stuart Mill, the socialist and the liberal, really want? Did they want radical equality, equality of income or circumstance? No, of course not. What they wanted was for the life prospects of the ordinary man and woman to be brought to a higher level. They wanted a higher level for ordinary humanity. More capabilities, more agency, more power, more experience, more intensity. That's what they wanted. They wanted more life, not radical equality. So the successor to this idea that the ideological conflict should be about shallow equality against shallow freedom is not the idea of radical equality of outcome. That's not it. Then it would be like the myth of ancient Rome or ancient Sparta. We're all poor and frugal and monastic together. Who wants that? No one wants that. So it's this other alternative. So what then should distinguish the right from the left? First, whether the left is the person who says, I don't accept the established institutional arrangements as the unsurpassable horizon of my political activity. I insist on going beyond this horizon. The conservatives are the ones who say that's the horizon. Unless something magical happens, or a revolution or a war, that's the horizon. Now, how do you go beyond the horizon? Because the Marxist view is it's all a system. It's an indivisible system. So politics is either the reformist management of one of these indivisible systems, like capitalism, or it's the revolutionary system of substitution of one system for another. But that's not what real structural change is like in history. Real structural change is always fragmentary. And the idea of the total substitution of one system for another is an idealized limit. It's not a real thing. It's fantastical. So we should think of this crossing of the institutional horizon as being always fragmentary and piecemeal, but nevertheless capable of being cumulative in a certain direction, and then it becomes radical. So that's one criterion for distinguishing the right and the left. Accepting or not accepting the established framework of institutions, beginning with the institutions of the market and the institutions of democracy. The second criterion for distinguishing the right and the left is the answer that you give to the question, is it natural for human life to be small? Now, who are the conservatives? The conservatives are the ones who say it's natural for human life to be small. And there is an exemption from this decree of belittlement in favor of an elite of heroes, inventors, entrepreneurs, saints, whatever. They can be not small, but everyone else must be small. Nietzsche, say Emerson, even though the Americans claimed that Emerson was a theorist of democracy. And who then are the progressives or the left? The left are the ones who claim everyone can become bigger. We can all rise to a higher form of life, provided that we rise together. That's the leftist belief. And so the combination of those two criteria determine or should determine the distinction between right and left. And not that idea that it's shallow freedom against shallow equality. So that's what we would want as the replacement belief. But that, of course, has to be the object of a struggle. That's a struggle of ideas, of conceptions of life, of what matters, and not something that will be done from one day to the next. Yes?
I find the calorie tax really appealing on the revenue-raising side, but I'm curious of your defense on the spending side, because I think the suggestion is that individuals who raise their investments to some high portion of their income, therefore are not taxed, and so they're spending on investments that raise the overall welfare of society, rather than that income being taxed and then spent by the
Yeah,
government on
but
something
then,
else.
but you've forgotten the other target of direct progressive taxation. The other target is the accumulation of economic power. So it's not as if the hierarchy of standards of living were a sufficient target. So there's another target. Now, as I admitted, that target is much harder to reach by taxation. The best way to reach it is a debt. And in these contemporary societies, it's very hard to address that. I remind you that it's not very long ago that the two richest men in the United States, who were then Warren Buffett and Bill Gates, undertook a campaign to defend the estate tax. And they took out full-page advertisements in the American newspapers defending the estate tax. And they failed. They failed to convince their fellow citizens that the high estate tax deserved to be preserved. The vast mass of the people, having no assets, defended a society in which you could inherit money without limit, practically. Yes?
I think and this goes back to the public debates, right? That why people with no property vote for property or vote against their interests. And I think it's because we live in this fallacy that people think there is social mobility or very easy social mobility.
Yes.
And they think that they can get rich, or they call it the
Of
death
course,
tax.
no, I understand all the illusions that might occur to them to explain this idea, but I'm just answering this question. So by no means is the taxation of the hierarchy of standards of living sufficient. We have to be combined with something. Now, I think you must remember that the second principle, right? It's a hierarchy of principles. The first principle is the most important. Don't forget that. The first principle is that what matters is the primary distribution of opportunity and advantage. Everything else is less important. So the corrective redistribution can never be an adequate substitute for the primary distribution. Because it's no good saying we're going to have a primary distribution that's all skewed, but then we'll take it all back for the secondary distribution. Because you can't take it all back. You can only take a little part of it back. Otherwise, you begin to mess up the whole economy, the society. You begin to create chaos. You say, we'll organize the economy this way, but then we'll take it all back. That's not realistic. That's not serious, and it's never been done. So the primary distribution trumps the secondary distribution. Then we come to the second principle. With respect to the secondary distribution, what matters most is the aggregate tax taken, how it's spent. And then we get into the discussion we were having. Then we come to the third principle. And if you nevertheless want to redistribute through taxation, this is how you do it. You confiscate inheritance, you tax consumption, individualized consumption on a steeply progressive base. It's not mysterious. This is how you do it if you really wanted to do it. And I have to say that there's no illusion in the United States. You were talking about this idea that the individual thinks of himself as a lottery. I once had a conversation with a very rich American who financed right-wing movements in the United States. And in order to lighten the conversation, I said, what was the secret of your success? How did you become rich? And he told me the following story. By my house, when I was a child, I was 7 years old, there was an orchard. And I discovered that I could buy apples for 5 cents and walk 2 or 3 blocks and sell them for 10 cents. And so I was buying more and more apples and accumulating my profits. And then I hired 2 other kids so that we could increase our output. And the business was developing fabulously. Then one day, my father died, and I was rich. So that's the explanation of this economic order. Now, shall we go back to the discussion of the most advanced practice of production? Okay, so the knowledge economy should not be mistaken for advanced manufacture, or much less for the platform oligopolies of Silicon Valley. The knowledge economy can exist in principle in every part of the production system, but in each part of the production system, it's an island, a fringe, which in its present form excludes the vast majority of workers and of firms. It nevertheless has an enormous potential. And this potential is hidden so long as it remains quarantined in these exclusive fringes. So I want to talk not just about its insularity and the reasons for the insularity, but about this larger potential that it might have if it were transformed into a knowledge economy for the many. So there are many claims made about the knowledge economy that result from this false identification of the knowledge economy with the platform oligopolies. And in fact, the platform oligopolies are an anomaly. They're like a corner of the knowledge economy. And they have a series of very special characteristics. So first of all, they depend on network effects, on the universality of the network. The universality of the network is the source or the basis of their economic value to their owners, but also of their social value, their value to society. And that's one of the reasons why it's very hard to imagine antitrust as an effective instrument with which to address the problems of these platform oligopolies. Because the destruction of the universality of the networks would undermine their social value as well as their economic value to their owners. And thus it's more interesting to deal with their pathologies by innovations in governance and in property regimes than simply by the blunt instrument of antitrust. The second characteristic of the platform oligopolies is that they can more easily internalize or assimilate the very expensive information and communication technologies by virtue of their size. So they can face or pay the high fixed costs that are required for the acquisition of these technologies. The third thing is that they benefit enormously from the near zero marginal cost of adding a customer to the network. Just a press of the button adds the customer to the platform. And this combination of the near zero marginal cost of adding someone with the network effects helps explain the idea that what characterizes the knowledge economy, if the knowledge economy were just these platform oligopolies, is expanding economies of scale, expanding returns to scale. And I'm going to say later why expanding returns to scale is not the right category with which to understand the economics of the knowledge economy. The fourth characteristic of the platform oligopolies is they benefit from a completely surprising and accidental loophole in the law of intellectual property. So in the economics of the knowledge economy, one of the characteristics is supposed to be the importance of excludability, that you can make a gain, the gain will be protected from expropriation because it will be excludable. But actually the platform oligopolies benefit from a species of non-legal excludability, which is that the data generated by customers or clients turns out to be free. And the entrepreneurs of the platform oligopolies discovered a way of making a business and a profit out of this free good, which are the data of the customers, which they then sell to their advertisers. So the platform oligopolies, and this becomes what in traditional economics would be called a rent. So this is the basis of a rent, and the rent is a rent paid to these oligopolies on the basis of this non-legal excludability of the data of the customers. That's the platform oligopolies. The platform oligopolies are an anomalous and exceptional corner of the knowledge economy. They don't hold the secrets of the knowledge economy, but the problem is that because now in the United States, they are the businesses with the largest value, the greatest market capitalization, they attract all the attention. And they then produce a completely false impression of the nature of the knowledge economy. So what then are the characteristics of the knowledge economy? It's not, we can't say it's a form of production based on ideas or that traffics in disembodied ideas, because every form of production is based on ideas. Conventional industry was based on ideas. All the technologies of conventional mass production were idea-laden, idea-penetrated, nor can we say that they traffic in disembodied ideas. That doesn't exist. Let's distinguish their superficial characteristics and the technical division of labor from their deeper characteristics, the characteristics which they would reveal completely only to the extent that they broke out of their islands, their fringes, and penetrated the production system as a whole. So first, the the firms of the knowledge economy, the productive practice of the knowledge economy, is able to combine the destandardization of goods and services with production at scale. So prior to the emergence of the knowledge economy, there was mass production, producing standardized goods and services at scale, and there was craft production, producing destandardized goods and services not at scale. And what has happened in the productive practices of the knowledge economy is that the scale of mass production is combined with a facility for destandardization characteristic of craft production. And that may be the beginning of an explanation for the following curious fact. Take Europe. The regions in Europe in which the knowledge economy has been most successful have been regions like southwest Germany, Baden-Württemberg, north-central Italy, Emilia-Romagna, or Catalonia in Spain. They are regions which were characterized prior to this historical period by a heavy presence of craft production. Traditions of apprenticeship in the associations of small and medium-sized firms, dense traditions of local government, and accumulation of social capital. So what you could say is that pre-Fordism turns out to be a very useful basis for post-Fordism. So the post-Fordist experimentalist enterprises have been able to lean on the culture and practices of the pre-Fordist businesses in Europe. Now, the second characteristic of the knowledge economy at the level of production engineering or of the technical division of labor is the combination of decentralization of initiative and heightening of trust or discretion with the preservation of momentum and coherence in the process of production. Let me give you a military analogy because it helps clarify what's at stake. Compare a traditional infantry brigade to a special forces or guerrilla operation. So the traditional infantry brigade has a command and control structure. There's a clear hierarchical line. There's a plan of combat, and then specialized roles determined by the position that each member of the force has in that combat plan. The nature of the guerrilla operation is that all of these lines are fudged. So the special forces of the guerrilla operation relativizes or effaces or softens the contrast between the supervisory roles and the executory roles, and simultaneously effaces or jumbles the divisions among the executory roles. So there's a division between supervision and execution, and then there's specialized roles of execution. If you efface the contrast between supervision and execution, you also begin to relativize the contrast among the specialized roles of execution. So each soldier then becomes responsible for the reinvention of the plan in the theater as he goes along. The equivalent to the plan of production is the plan of combat. Now, the question that is presented at the level of tactical or operational ideas is in the military, is how can a conventional regular force take on some of the attributes of an irregular force, of a special forces or guerrilla operation, without losing its characteristics of hierarchy, of coherence, of momentum in the field of battle. And that is the exact problem which is faced in the production plan of the knowledge economy. That is, it must take on some of these characteristics of relativization, of clear lines of contrast between supervision and execution, and clear lines of specialization without losing its coherence and momentum. And the narrow form of this in the history of industrial practices was called the Toyota method of production. So the workers, the tasks of production are attributed to teams of workers, not just to isolated individuals. These teams have a great deal of discretion to innovate in the process of production, and they then efface this contrast between supervision and execution, and they break down the clarity of the distinctions among the roles of execution. Now, these two sets of characteristics that I've just stated, combination of scale and destandardization, and combination of radical decentralization of initiative combined with the preservation of momentum and coherence in the plan of production are the surface. They're now a series of deeper characteristics which the knowledge economy in its present insular form does not fully reveal. It does not fully reveal because a practice of production reveals its character and potential only as it expands, only as it spreads throughout the economy, and crosses a series of barriers, is propagated throughout the production system, and then shows what it is. These next characteristics represent, to some extent, a speculation or an idealization, projecting forward the diffusion of the current productive practice in the economy as a whole. The first such characteristic is that the practices of the knowledge economy, considered in this way that I've just described, demand and allow a heightening of the discretionary initiative and of the reciprocal trust required of all participants in the process of production. So conventional industry is a command and control type of production system. The knowledge economy is a type of production system that requires cooperative experimentalism if it is to achieve its full potential. And it therefore flourishes against the background of an accumulation of social capital, associational density in the relations among its agents and participants. The second characteristic of the knowledge economy at this deeper level is that it points to an approximation between productive activity and the progress of knowledge or of imagination. It brings the history of production closer to the history of the mind, so that the best firms become more like the best schools, and production becomes a form of organized experimentalist inquiry. So some of the characteristic technologies of the knowledge economy dramatize this affinity. For example, additive manufacturing, so-called 3D printing, You have a conception, an abstract conception. You materialize the conception. The machine allows you to give a material form to what you imagine. Then when you materialize it, you go back to the conception. You revise the conception in the light of its materialization. And then you go back to another materialization. So the acceleration of this dialectic between the abstract conception and its materialization is the affirmation of this link between production and imagination. Now remember remarks that I made a couple of classes ago, a couple of weeks ago, about the nature of technology. And I said then, we can think of technology in two ways. We can think of it as a channel connecting our experiments in the mobilization of natural forces in our favor, forces like electricity, and our experiments in the organization of cooperation, the technical division of labor. So technology is simply the materialization of that channel. It connects experiments in using nature and experiments in how we work together. Second way of thinking about technology is that technology is about the frontier or the line separating what we have learned how to repeat from what we have not yet learned how to repeat. So everything that we can express in a formula or an algorithm, we can embody in a machine. Everything that we've learned how to repeat, we can express in a formula or an algorithm. And everything that we can express in a formula or an algorithm, we can in turn embody in a machine. So what's the point of the machine? The point of the machine is to do for us what we have learned how to repeat so that we can preserve our time, which in a sense is not only our greatest resource, but at the end of the day, our only resource. So that we can preserve our time. And therefore, in the light of this idea, the partnership, the connection of the human being with imagination and of the machine should be much more powerful than either of them alone. Now, this idea, of course, depends on a conception of the mind. And now let me make explicit the conception of the mind. So a conception of the mind is that the mind has two sides. Our mental experience has two sides. In one side, the mind is modular and formulaic. The brain has different parts. The parts are specialized. They have specialized functions. But in another side of our mental experience, the mind is not modular or formulaic. The physical attribute of plasticity allows different parts of the brain to take on different functions. Our mental experience displays the attribute which in mathematics we call recursive infinity, that we can combine everything with everything else, and the attribute that the poet called negative capability. In other words, we can discover something that does not yet make sense in the light of our established presuppositions and our settled methods. And then we can retrospectively discover the methods and the presuppositions that make sense of what we have discovered. That's the imagination. In the imagination, we subsume something under a range of accessible variation. The way we understand anything is to understand what it can next become, given certain interventions. And then these possible, accessible, possible states of affairs, the there to which we can get from here, then determine our insight into the actual. That's the imagination. Nothing in the physical structure of the brain predetermines the relative force of these two sides of our mental experience. The mechanical side, modular and formulaic, and the anti-modular, anti-formulaic, imaginative side. The organization of society and of culture is what determines the relative force of these two sides of our mental experience. And in this sense, you could say that the history of politics is internal to the history of the mind. So in the knowledge economy, we have the promise or the potential of a very intimate connection between production and imagination. And it would point in a particular direction. It would say, what we want from our machines is not just that they replace us, although to some extent technology will always replace labor. What we want from our machines is that they enhance us. So the relation between the human being and the machine should be like this. The human being should be running in front of the machine. That is, the frontier of what we can repeat, what we have learned how to repeat, will always expand. But we go ahead with imagination. And this combination of the human being with imagination and the machine without imagination should in principle be much more powerful than either of them alone. That's what we would want. But of course, for the knowledge economy to become that, it would have to become something very different from what it now is. And it would have to break out of these quarantines, these ghettos, these sits that it's now arrested in, and propagate throughout the whole of production system. Now I come to a third deeper characteristic of the knowledge economy. And that has to do with the promise in the knowledge economy to limit or reverse what has been the most constant regularity in economic life. And this is a little more complicated, so let me try to explain. There are two concepts that are very close together, but that must not be confused with each other. The concept of increasing returns to scale, and the concept of diminishing marginal returns. So it is common in the literature of the knowledge economy to claim that the knowledge economy is characterized by increasing returns to scale. In fact, it appears to be characterized by increasing returns to scale only if we mistakenly identify it with the corner, the anomaly of the platform oligopolies, with their network effects, their advantages of zero marginal cost of addition of a client or customer, the advantage of being able to absorb the higher fixed costs of internalizing the new technologies and so forth. Increasing returns to scale means if you increase proportionately if you increase all of the inputs to a process of production, the output should increase proportionately. That's what increasing returns, no, that's what constant returns to scale mean. And increasing returns to scale would occur if the output increases more than the inputs. So the presumption is constant returns to scale. That's the default presumption in economics. But constant returns to scale are a defeasible or rebuttable presumption. Their role in economic theory is similar to the role of constant motion without friction in Newtonian mechanics. In other words, constant returns to scale applies only in the absence of 100 different factors that could negate it and perpetually do negate it. A larger factory can be more or less efficient than a smaller factory, depending, for example, on prejudicial or beneficial interactions among the inputs. Constant returns to scale is not a law of economics. Constant returns to scale is just a default presumption that is constantly reversed in practice in one way or another. And then the platform oligopolies would benefit from increasing returns to scale on the basis of all of those particularities that I enumerated. And this is then sometimes mistaken for a characteristic of the knowledge economy. Diminishing returns to scale, diminishing marginal returns, is an entirely different concept describing an entirely different problem. So if you hold constant all the inputs to a process of production, and you increase just one of them, the returns to that increased input will rise, plateau, and then eventually fall. That could be regarded as the most universal and persistent constraint in economic life. The pre-classical, the pre-marginalist economists, whom we call classical, were fascinated by this phenomenon of diminishing marginal returns, but they didn't understand it. They had no vocabulary to understand it. The marginalist economists of the late 19th century thought that they understood it, but they had a specious explanation for it. They said diminishing marginal returns must hold as a logical consequence of constant returns to scale. Because unless there were diminishing marginal returns, there wouldn't be constant returns to scale. As the diminishing marginal returns would be to preserve constant returns to scale. There would be, as it were, a logical consequence of the presumption of constant returns to scale. But of course, constant returns to scale was never a law to start with. It was just a presumption that would hold in the absence of any of the circumstances that might negate it. By contrast, diminishing marginal returns is the closest thing that economics has to being a law. So how could you deduce something that's non-law-like, that's something that is law-like, from something that's not law? It doesn't make any sense. It's a specious explanation. So how are we to understand then the phenomenon of diminishing marginal returns? Well, here's just a speculative suggestion. You could say, think of an increased input as an innovation. And suppose that the innovations are episodic or discontinuous. So you have an innovation, you internalize the innovation, you use it in production, it produces the return increases while its effect is being exercised, then eventually its effect is exhausted and you have to wait for the next innovation. So if the process of innovation is punctuated or discontinuous, it's more likely that this phenomenon of diminishing marginal returns to each of the discrete innovations will be manifest. And of course, it's more likely that this will occur if the innovations are imported from outside the production system, from the advance of science or technology, because then each scientific or technological innovation will be something new. It will be brought into the economy. It will exert its effect for a while. It will plateau and then decrease. But to the extent that the process of innovation becomes permanent or continuous, then it's less likely that there will be this phenomenon of decreasing marginal returns. And it's less likely there will be discontinuous if the production system itself becomes a model or a mirror of the advance of science. If productive experimentalism becomes the dominant characteristic of productive activity. So we could then say, from the standpoint of the speculative idea, that the whole history of the economy could be divided into 3 moments or 3 periods. There'd be first a moment in which the fundamental constraint on economic growth is the coercive extraction of a surplus over current consumption. So you can only grow when you coercively extract something from current consumption to save for the future. The second moment is when coercive extraction of a surplus no longer becomes a significant constraint. And here the economists were mistaken. The 2 greatest economic theorists were Karl Marx and Adam Smith. Both of them thought that the coercive extraction of a surplus was the main necessity in the economies of their own time. For example, Karl Marx held that the main reason for the existence of a class system was the necessity for coercively extracting a surplus from the workers. But we now know that the aggregate level of saving, both public and private, in Britain, for example, on the eve of the Industrial Revolution, was lower, not higher, than the aggregate level of saving in the stagnant agrarian bureaucratic empires. So what was decisive to economic transformation was not the surplus over current consumption. It was a series of innovations, conceptual, institutional, organizational, technological, which changed everything, not the coercive extraction of a surplus. So then the second moment is the moment at which innovation, discontinuous innovation, becomes the main constraint on economic growth. And that corresponds to the entire world history of the economy, of the civilized economies, and including to all the imperial entities that have been the main protagonists in world history. Then there would be a third moment, which a radicalized form of the knowledge economy would inaugurate, in which scarcity remains the main constraint, but the constraint of the law of diminishing marginal returns is lifted, because innovation becomes permanent and becomes internal to the process of production. Now, Marx and Keynes both believed that we were on the verge of overcoming scarcity. Keynes wrote about this in his essay, Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, and Marx wrote about this in the introduction to the Critique of the Gotha Program. And I think they were both mistaken. We're not on the verge of overcoming scarcity. Scarcity is endlessly reproduced in new forms. And they also both believed, Marx and Keynes, that work was a hateful burden, that we could escape as a result of overcoming scarcity. So Marx describes in the introduction to the Critique of the Gotha Program how we could devote ourselves to the private sublime to poetry, to fishing, to art, to our aesthetic and religious experiences by virtue of overcoming the dictates of scarcity. And Keynes thought the same thing. They were mistaken on both counts. We're not on the verge of overcoming scarcity. And we can aspire to acquire freedom in the economy and not just from the economy. And some forms of production are much more hospitable to the exercise of our freedom, of our productive freedom, of our agency, than others. So the knowledge economy, which we now have in this insular form, associated with a whole set of perversities, holds this potential to loosen, relax, or even reverse what has been the most constant law or regularity in economic life, the regularity of diminishing marginal returns. So this is not the knowledge economy that we have, right? The knowledge economy that we have is not the knowledge economy that manifests the creation of a form of economic life that diminishes the imperative of hierarchy and specialization, cooperative experimentalism. It's not the form of economic life that realizes the potential of turning production into a form of experimentalist inquiry. It's not the form of economic life that can loosen or reverse the law of diminishing marginal return, but holds this promise of moving in that direction, depending on how we shape it. So why does the knowledge economy now appear in this form? Of being insular and excluding the vast majority of workers and firms. And I think we can give two basic kinds of explanations. So one explanation is that unlike mass production, conventional industry, the productive vanguard that had succeeded in the history of the economy, it is neither stereotypical nor minimalist in its requirements. So I said, conventional industry was minimalist in its requirements, its institutional and educational requirements. It required very little by way of institutions or education. And moreover, it was a stereotype of kit. It was like a kit, a small repertoire of the main sets of metal cutting lathes and steam combustion engines and so forth, which you could literally put on an airplane and take to another country. It was both minimalist and stereotypical. The knowledge economy is not like that. It is maximalist in its requirements. And it does not lend itself to being reduced to this stereotypical set of practices and technologies. It's open-ended. So that's one kind of explanation. But that's a very partial explanation. And we must therefore invoke a second kind of explanation. Whenever there is a set of innovations in the world, the tendency is to establish those innovations in the form that least disturbs or attacks the ruling interests and the established preconceptions. That's what we could call the path of least resistance. And in fact, the knowledge economy is adapted now. It evolves in what are class societies. All the societies established in the world are class societies, some more than others. And in all of them, there are established preconceptions that limit the propagation of the new possibilities, and as it were, downsize them or adapt them to the constraints of class society. This is what the path of least resistance. Now, there's the following general characteristic, which is of great importance, not just to this discussion, but to all of our discussions during the semester. The path of least resistance is always the easiest path, but it's never the only path or the necessary path. The path of least resistance has something going for it and something going against it. What it has going forward is that it's easiest to reconcile with the established order in the world, with the dominant interest, with the dominant ideas. It requires less subversion, less revolution, less resistance, all of these things. But characteristically, the path of least resistance always limits the potential of the innovations. So the path of least resistance always has adversaries. The opposition to the path of least resistance. And the adversaries have going for them not just the interests that they defend, but the failure to take advantage of the potential. What they have going for them is the claim that the knowledge economy, in an inclusive form, would have a much more revolutionary, emancipatory, and productivist potential for growth and for emancipation than the insular form that it takes. That's the basis for a debate in the world, for a conflict in world politics. And that then is the doorway to this discussion of the inclusive knowledge economy. The insular knowledge economy, the exclusive knowledge economy that we have, is a characteristic instance of the path of least resistance. It is the containment, the downsizing, the limitation of this great revolutionary change in the productive possibilities of humanity for the convenience of the established interest in ideas. And therefore, it invites this line of resistance that I just described. And that then is the gateway to our discussion next week of the knowledge economy for the many. Now we have a few minutes. Would someone like to make some preliminary statement about this? You see the idea that I'm having. The struggle is to form a conception of the knowledge economy that doesn't degenerate into techno-optimism or into some kind of idealization, that sees it for what it is, as being insular, fragmentary, suppressing of potential. It's associated with a set of perversities, like, for example, the consignment of labor around the world to precarious employment, the creation of this hierarchy. But it has this huge potential, this potential for liberation, which, if you were to take seriously the contrast that I drew before in the class about right and left, would serve directly the interests of the left. The inclusive knowledge economy would be a characteristic project of the left, because what is it about? It's about lifting the power of the ordinary man and woman, a higher level of life, of capability, of intensity and scope, by transgressing the institutional horizon. It's exactly an example of that. And that's why it's so difficult but it has this prophetic character, this transformational promise. And of course, that guarantees that it will be in complete opposition to the temper of our times. I'm very aware of the truth of Voltaire's warning that those who lack the spirit of their times will nevertheless, the spirit of their age will nevertheless have all of its defects. But I'm going to insist on the prophetic impulse. So we'll continue next week. I thought, by the way, that our detour through the discussion of taxation was instructive. And I hope we will revisit it another time. Yes. I don't think the knowledge economy exists in any country. But I do think that some of the smaller European countries, like Denmark, if I had to choose, would be the ones that there's more of it. Because there you see these networks of highly advanced small and medium-sized firms, this increase of social capital, this experimental establishment. So if you asked me to choose a country, I would say Denmark or Finland. I don't